What if the ground beneath an ordinary American highway, beneath the parking lot of a quiet shopping mall, beneath a backyard where children once played in summer grass, was hiding something that history books had quietly chosen to forget? What if somewhere in the heart of the continent, just east of where the Mississippi River bends past the modern skyline of St. Louis, the bones of a city older than most European capitals were still sleeping under the soil, waiting for someone to remember their name? It is a strange thing to consider, this idea that an entire civilization, with its plazas and its priests, its markets and its morning songs, could rise to a population larger than London at the same moment in history and then simply dissolve into silence. Not destroyed in a single fiery night, not buried by a volcano, not erased by an invading army that left its conqueror's chronicles behind, just gone, quietly, over generations, until the forest grew over the mounds and the rivers shifted their banks and the people who once knew the city's true name carried it away with them into other lands, other languages, other ways of being, and the rest of the world that would later draw maps and write encyclopedias, somehow never quite learned to see what had been there. The story that unfolds in the next several hours is the story of that absence. It is the story of a place called Cahokia, though the people who built it almost certainly called it something else, something that has faded from every recorded tongue. It is the story of what happens when a civilization rises faster than any historian can comfortably explain, when it builds earthen pyramids that rival the monuments of the old world, when it organizes the labor of tens of thousands of human hands and then, within a few centuries, lets it all slip back into quiet. It is the story of a mystery that sits at the center of the North American continent, hidden in plain sight, and of the questions that keep returning to anyone who walks across its grassy mounds at dusk, and wonders why the textbook said so little, and why what little they said felt always slightly afraid of the truth. Before the rest of this journey begins, before the listener allows the body to soften into the comfort of the night, perhaps it is worth pausing for a small kindness. If this voice, this slow unwinding of forgotten things, is becoming a familiar companion in the dark hours, a small gesture would help these stories continue to find others who need them. A like, a subscription, a simple act of saying yes to more, but only if the work feels true, only if the silence between these words has begun to feel like home. And there is one more invitation, gentle and curious. Where is the listener tonight? In which city, which countryside, which apartment by which river is this voice arriving? It is a small thing to mention the place and the hour in the comments below, but over time those names gather like quiet constellations beneath each story, a map of all the strangers who have shared the same dark together. And somehow that map matters. Now, with that small ritual completed, the descent begins. Imagine the year 1100 or somewhere close to it. In Europe, the first Crusaders are returning from Jerusalem with relics and rumours. In China, the Song dynasty is refining its porcelain and its poetry. In the Mesoamerican highlands, the Toltecs are giving way to new powers. And in the middle of North America, in the broad floodplain where three great rivers meet, a city is at the height of its life. Smoke rises from thousands of hearths. Voices in unknown languages drift across plazas the size of stadiums. A pyramid of earth, larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza, climbs toward the sky in stepped terraces. On its summit stands a long building of timber and thatch, and inside that building things are happening that no surviving record has ever fully described. The strangeness is not only that this place existed, the strangeness is that it should not, by the assumptions of the older histories, have existed at all. North of Mexico, the textbooks once insisted, There had been no cities before Europeans arrived. There had been villages, hunting bands, scattered farmers, but nothing that deserved the heavy word civilization. And yet here, hidden under the cornfields of southern Illinois, were the ruins of a metropolis that had once been larger than London, larger than Paris in the same century, larger than any settlement in what would become the United States until Philadelphia surpassed it in the late 1700s. The implications were uncomfortable. They're uncomfortable still, because if a city of this size could rise and fall and be erased so completely from common memory, what else might be missing from the story that everyone has been told? There is a particular kind of silence that settles over places like this. It is not the silence of a place that was never inhabited. It is the silence of a place where something was once very loud, and then was deliberately or perhaps despairingly allowed to grow quiet. The grasses bend in the wind across the broad, flat earth, and the mounds rise like the backs of sleeping animals, and somewhere far below the surface, the post holes of vanished palisades, the charred floors of vanished houses, the bones of those who once watched the stars from this exact spot, all of them wait, not for rescue, not for explanation, only perhaps for the rare listener who is willing to sit in the dark long enough to feel the shape of what is missing. To begin to understand why a city of this magnitude rose precisely where it did, one has to set aside, at least for a little while, the modern habit of seeing the land as a flat backdrop on which human stories happen to unfold. The land is never flat in that sense. It has its own gravity, its own quiet preferences, its own way of pulling certain kinds of life towards certain places and letting others slip past unnoticed. And nowhere in North America does the land pull more insistently than in the broad green hollow, where three great river systems lean toward one another and finally meet in the floodplain that archaeologists have come to call, with a peculiar plainness, the American bottom. Picture the continent from above, the way a hawk circling at great height might see it. The Mississippi runs nearly the full length of the land, slicing south from the cold lakes of the north toward the warm gulf that swallows it. From the west, reaching back toward the high empty grasslands and the distant white teeth of the Rockies, comes the Missouri, brown and powerful and old. From the northeast, threading through prairies and oak savannas toward the inland seas of the Great Lakes, comes the Illinois, where these three currents draw close to one another, where their waters mingle and their floods overlap. There is a strip of low ground, perhaps 100 miles long and several miles wide, flat as a still pond, scrubbed smooth by 10,000 years of seasonal flooding. This is the place that pulled the people in. This is where the city would eventually rise. To the modern mind, accustomed to roads and rails and engines, it is easy to forget what rivers once were. They were not picturesque features of the landscape. They were not obstacles to bridge or scenery to admire from a porch. They were highways, the only true highways of a world without wheels or pack animals. A skilled paddler in a well-made dugout canoe could travel hundreds of miles in a few weeks, gliding with the current, slipping through portages between drainages, carrying trade goods and family members and rumours and ceremonies and seeds across distances that would have taken months to walk. The rivers connected everything. They were the nerves and arteries of an entire continent, and the place where the three greatest of them came nearly together was, by simple geographical logic, the place where everything could meet. But it was not only the convenience of travel that drew people to the American bottom, it was the soil itself. Every spring, when the snowmelt swelled the upstream reaches and the rains pounded the prairies, the rivers rose and spread thin sheets of water across the floodplain. When those waters receded, they left behind a fresh layer of silt, dark and rich and full of nutrients carried down from 1,000 miles away. After centuries of this rhythm, After millennia, the ground in the American bottom was among the most naturally fertile in the world. A handful of that earth, crumbled between the fingers, had within it the dust of mountains and the rot of forests and the patient mineral wealth of an entire continent compressed into a single square inch of darkness. Anything planted in it grew with a force that could feel almost alarming. And there was more. The floodplain teemed with life in a way that is difficult to imagine now, when modern agriculture has tamed and emptied so much of it. Vast flocks of waterfowl darken the sky during the seasonal migrations, geese and ducks and cranes pouring down from the north in autumn and back from the south in spring. The rivers were thick with fish. The marshes hummed with frogs and turtles and crayfish. Deer drifted in herds through the bottomland forests, drawn to the soft browse near the water's edge. Walnuts and hickories and pecans dropped their harvests by the bushel into the leaf litter every fall. A single family with reasonable knowledge of the seasons could feed itself here without ever planting a seed, simply by paying attention. And the people who came to this place, generation after generation for thousands of years, did pay attention. They learned its rhythms with the kind of devotion that only survival can teach. Yet there was another quality to the American bottom that mattered, perhaps even more than the soil and the game and the rivers, and it is a quality that often goes unmentioned because it has no easy name. The place was visible. In a continent where most communities lived scattered in small clusters across enormous distances, where finding another group of humans could mean walking for days through unbroken forest, the American bottom was a landmark that anyone with a canoe could find. The bluffs that rose along its eastern edge were tall enough to be seen from far across the floodplain. The confluence of the rivers was unmistakable on any mental map. To say one came from the place where the great waters met was to name a location that another speaker hundreds of miles away would immediately recognize. Reputation in such a world depended on being findable, and the American bottom was perhaps the most findable place on the continent. For thousands of years before any city arose there, the floodplain had already been a gathering ground. People had come and gone across it, leaving their hearths and their broken pots and their burials in shallow scatters across the high ground. The archaeologists who would later study these traces would speak of cultural phases, of archaic and woodland and Mississippian, names that try to organize an immense slow continuity into something the modern mind can hold. But the people themselves would have known nothing of these labels. They would have known only that this was a good place, that the elders said the elders before them had said the same, that when a hard year came, it was here that a family could find enough to survive the winter, that when something needed to be celebrated or mourned on a scale larger than a single village could manage, this was where the gathering would be. By the time the centuries began to roll toward the year 1000, the floodplain was already humming with a denser kind of life than anywhere else north of the Rio Grande. Small villages dotted the high ground above the floods. Garden plots crept along the terraces. Mounds, some of them already old, rose in scattered groups, marking the places where ancestors had been honoured, or where the powers of the earth and sky were thought to come close. Something was beginning to gather here. Something was beginning to stand up, and whatever it was still mostly silent, still mostly waiting, still mostly hidden in the slow accumulation of soil and memory beneath the open sky. There is a habit, deeply ingrained in the way history is usually told, of beginning every story with an arrival. Someone comes from somewhere else, a people migrate, a founder steps onto the shore. The land before that arrival is treated as a kind of empty stage, waiting for the curtain to rise. Yet when one stands on the floodplain east of the Mississippi and lets the eye travel across the soft folds of the earth, this habit begins to feel not only inadequate but almost dishonest. The land here had not been waiting. It had been lived in, continuously, attentively, intimately for at least 12,000 years before the great mounds began to rise. To begin the story of Cahokia in the 11th century is to skip past the slow, patient inheritance that made the city possible, and that inheritance is itself a kind of buried truth, half remembered and half erased. 12,000 years is a span of time that resists comprehension. It contains 400 or 500 human generations, each one passing on, by example and by story, the accumulated knowledge of how to live in a particular landscape. Long before any maize was planted in the American bottom, long before any pyramid of earth was even imagined, people were here. They watched the floods come and go. They learned which terraces stayed dry when the rivers overspilled their banks, and which ones became islands or vanished altogether. They learned where the springs ran sweet through the dry months. They learned the precise stretches of bank where the bass schooled in spring, the hollows where the deer would bed down in winter snow, the groves where hickory nuts fell thick enough to gather a winter's worth of food in a single industrious week. None of this was casual knowledge. None of it could be looked up. It existed only in the minds of people who had been taught it as children by parents who'd been taught it as children, and who would pass it on in turn to their own. This was the kind of knowing that the modern world has largely forgotten how to value. It was not written down because it could not be written down. It was not abstract or systematic. It was woven into the rhythms of daily life, into the songs sung over the cooking fires, into the names given to particular bends of the river or particular outcrops of stone. A child growing up in such a community would not have learned the seasons as a list of months. The child would have learned them as a long, slow conversation between the body and the world, marked by the first appearance of certain birds, the ripening of certain berries, the changing colour of the river in early spring when the snowmelt arrived from the north. Time itself was experienced differently. It was not a line stretching from past to future. It was a wheel, turning patiently, carrying everything that mattered around again and again with small variations. For most of those 12,000 years, life in the river valley was organised around movement, not the wandering of people without direction, as the older histories sometimes condescendingly described it, but a careful seasonal rotation through a known territory. A family or band would gather in one place during the fish runs of late winter, drift to another for the spring goose hunts, settle for a longer summer at a place where wild plants could be harvested in abundance, then move again to be near the deer trails when autumn came. Each location had its own meaning, its own associated stories, its own remembered ancestors who had used it before. The land was not a resource to be extracted. It was a relative to be visited. To pass through a particular meadow without acknowledging the spirits or the memories tied to it would have been a kind of rudeness, a forgetting that no proper person allowed. This way of living was not stagnant. It evolved slowly and almost invisibly across the centuries. New tools appeared in the archaeological record, then disappeared, then reappeared in slightly different forms. Pottery, when it finally arrived in the eastern woodlands several thousand years before Cahokia, transformed the way food could be stored and cooked. The atlatl gave way eventually to the bow. Burial customs shifted, with some peoples beginning to inter their dead in carefully prepared mounds, marking the landscape with the bodies of those who had loved it. Each of these innovations rippled outward along the river networks, carried by traders and travellers and intermarriages, and each of them subtly rewrote the possibilities of what life in the valley could be. Yet beneath all the changes something steady persisted. There was a continuity of presence in this land that almost no other part of North America could match. Site after site, layer after layer, the archaeologists who would later excavate the river terraces would find the same essential pattern. People had lived here. They'd left in summer and returned in winter. They'd built their fires in the same hollows where their grandparents had built theirs. They had buried their dead in the same hilltops, sometimes adding to graves that had been started 1,000 years earlier by someone whose name they no longer remembered, but whose presence they still acknowledged. The accumulation was almost geological in its slowness. Generation laid upon generation, like silt upon silt, each one slightly enriching the soil of memory. It is worth pausing to consider what this kind of continuity actually means. In most parts of the world, a community that has lived in one place for 2 or 3 centuries thinks of itself as deeply rooted. The villages of medieval Europe boasted of ancestral lines, reaching back perhaps to the days of Charlemagne, and that boast was considered impressive. But here, in the floodplain of the great rivers, families could, in principle, have traced their presence back not to a specific king or saint, but to the very edge of the last ice age. They had been here when the glaciers were still retreating to the north. They had been here when the megafauna, the mammoths and the giant ground sloths still walked the prairies. They had been here when the climate shifted and the forest crept back across land that had been tundra. They'd been here long enough to forget more than most peoples have ever known. This was the soil, both literal and cultural, into which the seeds of a city would eventually be dropped. And the soil itself was already alive with memory. It contained in its layered darkness the bones and the broken tools and the cooking ash of countless lives. When at last someone began to gather basket after basket of that earth and pile it into mounds, they were not building from nothing. They were building from a depth that their own minds could not entirely fathom, a depth that would, in the centuries to come, give the rising city a kind of weight that no shorter history could ever have provided. Out of all the slow accumulations that prepared the ground for what would later rise, none was stranger or more transformative than the arrival of a single grass. It came from the south, from the highlands of central Mexico, where it had been carefully bred over thousands of years from a wild ancestor that hardly resembled it anymore. The wild grass had borne perhaps a dozen tiny hard kernels along a brittle stalk, scarcely worth the labour of harvesting. By the time the cultivated form began its long, slow journey north and east, it had become something else entirely. The cobs were thicker, the kernels larger, the yields generous enough to justify the back-bending labour of clearing land and tending rows. Maize. The grass that would, more than any other single thing, change the rules of life in the river valleys of the eastern continent. The journey of maize across North America was not a single dramatic event. It was a long, fitful, generation-by-generation migration. Each new region required adaptation. The plant had to be coaxed into producing in shorter growing seasons, in different soils, under different patterns of rainfall. Communities along the way experimented and failed and experimented again, selecting seeds from the plants that performed best, gradually breeding regional varieties suited to the conditions of each new latitude. By around the year 800, perhaps a century or two earlier in some places, maize agriculture had taken firm hold in the floodplains of the Midwest. And in the American bottom, where the soil was darker and richer than almost anywhere else, the plant flourished in a way that must have astonished those who had only known the older, leaner forms of cultivation. The productivity of maize is difficult to overstate, especially in fertile floodplain soils. A single well-tended plot could feed a family for an entire year, with surplus left over to store, to trade, to share at gatherings, to offer in ceremony. Compared to the older mosaic of wild plant gathering, hunting, and small garden cultivation that had supported earlier communities, maize agriculture represented an enormous leap in the calories that could be wrung from a fixed piece of ground. And maize did not come alone. Almost from the beginning of its spread, It travelled in the company of two other plants that would together form a kind of cultivated trinity, each one supporting the others in a system that was greater than the sum of its parts. Beans came alongside, climbing the maize stalks as if they had been planted there for that very purpose. The roots of beans, like those of all legumes, harboured bacteria that drew nitrogen from the air and fixed it into the soil, replenishing what the hungry maize was constantly drawing out. Squash sprawled along the ground between the rows, its broad leaves shading the earth, holding moisture in the soil during dry weeks, suppressing the weeds that would otherwise have competed with the precious grains. The three plants together, what later peoples would come to call the Three Sisters, were not merely a collection of crops grown side by side. They were an ecological partnership, a piece of agricultural genius developed over centuries of careful observation, refined into an interlocking strategy that allowed a single field to produce more, year after year, than any one of the plants could have managed alone. When this system arrived in full force in the American bottom, it changed everything. The first and most obvious change was demographic. More food meant more children survived their early years. More children meant larger families, larger villages, denser settlement along the most productive stretches of bottomland. Within a few generations, the population of the valley was climbing in a way it had never climbed before. Houses began to cluster more tightly. Storage pits multiplied behind every dwelling. Deep, cool cellars dug into the earth to hold the dried kernels through the long months between harvests. The slow seasonal mobility that had defined life for thousands of years began, almost imperceptibly, to give way to something more rooted. People could afford to stay in one place because the place itself had begun to give them enough. But the deeper change, the one that would eventually make a city possible, was less visible and far stranger. When a community moves seasonally through a known territory, when it lives lightly on the land and disperses when conflicts arise, its social arrangements can remain relatively simple. Disputes are resolved by separation. Difficult relatives can walk away. Decisions are made within small groups bound by close kinship, and the absence of accumulated property means that disagreements rarely escalate beyond what a few elders can talk through over a fire. But when a community invests its labour into a field, when it has cleared the brush and planted the rows and built the granaries that hold the winter's survival, walking away becomes far more costly. The investment must be defended. The harvest must be shared in ways that everyone agrees are fair, or the agreements that hold the community together will begin to fray. New rules are needed, new roles, new ways of binding people to one another that go beyond the simple ties of blood. This is the quiet revolution that maize set in motion. It is rarely told this way because the change happened slowly and across many generations, but the people who lived through it were watching their entire social world reorganize itself around the demands of a single grass. Who got to plant in the best fields? Who decided when the harvest was ripe? Who held the granary keys, so to speak, when winter came and the stores had to be rationed? Who spoke for the village when a neighbouring community wanted to trade or to dispute a boundary? These questions had not needed clear answers in the older mobile life, but in the new sedentary life they pressed in from every direction. And the answers that emerged, gradually, would lay the groundwork for the kind of organised authority that a city like Cahokia would one day require. There is something almost unsettling about realising how much of human history has turned on the quiet decisions of a plant. The maize did not know what it was doing, it was simply being itself, responding to the careful selection of human hands. But in becoming what it became, it remade the people who grew it. It pulled them out of the rhythm they had known for 10,000 years and pushed them into a new rhythm whose full consequences no one could have foreseen. The villages thickened, the granaries deepened, The mounds, which had previously been modest gestures honouring the dead or marking sacred ground, began to grow taller, more deliberate, more central to the life of the community. Something was building in the floodplain, something that had no precedent in this land, and the wind that moved through the tall green rows of maize each summer carried, perhaps, the first whisper of what was coming next. Long before any basket of earth was carried up the slopes of what would one day become the great mound at the heart of the city, the people of the eastern woodlands had already been building. Quietly, in scattered places across an enormous swath of the continent, generations of hands had been gathering soil and shaping it into forms that meant something more than mere accumulation. The practice was old, far older than maize, far older than the village patterns that maize would eventually create. It reached back into a time when the very idea of a city would have made no sense to anyone living in this land, and yet the gestures that would eventually make a city possible were already being rehearsed in the dirt. The Hopewell tradition was perhaps the most spectacular of these earlier rehearsals. Centered in what is now Ohio and parts of Illinois, the Hopewell peoples had reached their cultural peak roughly 1,000 years before Cahokia's rise, between the early centuries of the Common Era and somewhere around the year 400 or 500. They had built earthworks of geometric precision that still astonish anyone who walks among them today. Vast circles, perfect octagons, square enclosures hundreds of meters across, all laid out across the landscape with a care that suggests both mathematical sophistication and a deep ritual purpose. Some of these enclosures align with the rising and setting of celestial bodies, including the long cycle of the moon's swings across the horizon, a cycle so slow that it requires patient observation across nearly 2 decades to track. To build such a structure was to declare, in the language of Earth itself, that this people understood time on a scale far longer than any single human life. Yet what makes the Hopewell tradition most relevant to the story of Cahokia is not only the geometry of their earthworks, but the astonishing reach of their connections. In the burial mounds of the Hopewell, archaeologists have found objects whose origins stretch across the entire breadth of the continent. Copper from the deep veins around Lake Superior hammered into ornaments and ritual blades. Mica from the Appalachian Mountains, peeled into translucent sheets that catch the light like frozen water. Obsidian from the Yellowstone region, hauled across 2,000 miles of plains and rivers. Shark's teeth and conch shells from the Gulf of Mexico, carried up the great river systems and laid into graves alongside the bodies of the honoured dead. These were not the possessions of an isolated culture. They were the visible signs of a continent-wide network of exchange and shared meaning that had been operating in some form for centuries before any city north of Mexico had begun to dream itself into being. The questions this raises are unsettling, and they are questions that mainstream histories have rarely been comfortable to ask in full. How did such a network function without writing, without horses, without wheeled vehicles? Who organized the long expeditions that brought obsidian from the Rockies to Ohio? What kind of agreements bound peoples thousands of miles apart into a shared system of ritual exchange? And why, after several centuries of remarkable activity, did the Hopewell tradition itself fade, leaving its great earthworks to be slowly forgotten, its trade routes to attenuate, its particular vision of meaning to dissolve into something less monumental and more local? The answers, when they exist at all, are partial and contested. Some scholars speak of climate shifts, of crop failures, of internal stresses that strained the elaborate ceremonial system until it could no longer hold. Others suggest that the very ambition of Hopewell, its willingness to draw labour and materials from across enormous distances, eventually outran its ability to sustain itself. Whatever the cause, By the time the centuries began to roll toward the year 800, the Hopewell world had grown quiet. But quiet is not the same as gone. This is one of the lessons that the deep history of the eastern woodlands keeps offering if anyone is willing to listen. When a great cultural fluorescence fades, it does not simply vanish, it leaves seeds in the cultural soil. The knowledge of how to build a mound does not evaporate when the last great Hopewell complex falls silent. It passes into smaller hands, into local traditions, into the everyday practices of communities that no longer construct geometric earthworks of continental ambition, but who still know somehow that earth can be shaped into meaning. The trade networks do not entirely collapse. They thin, they reroute, they wait. The cosmological vocabulary, the sense that certain directions and certain alignments matter, that the landscape itself can be made to speak through careful arrangement, remains in the air like a half-forgotten language. In the centuries between the fading of Hopewell and the explosive rise of Cahokia, the eastern woodlands hosted a kind of long, restless interlude. Communities continued to build smaller mounds, pottery styles evolved. New forms of organization emerged in different regions, each adapted to local conditions, none yet reaching the scale or intensity that would later appear in the American bottom. Archaeologists have learned to call this broader cultural pattern the Mississippian world, though that label is, like all such labels, an approximation. It refers to a loosely shared set of practices, an emerging family of cultures that built flat-top platform mounds, cultivated maize intensively, organized themselves into chiefdoms of varying complexity, and traded across substantial distances. The label suggests a unity that was probably never as tidy as the term implies, but it captures something real. By the years just before Cahokia's rise, an entire cultural world had been quietly assembling itself across the eastern half of the continent. A world that shared certain habits of building and meaning. A world that was already humming with a kind of latent capacity for something larger. What was missing was a place where all of these accumulated capacities could converge into something genuinely new. The knowledge of mound building had been preserved across generations. The agricultural surplus that maize provided was now firmly established. The trade routes that had once carried Hopewell obsidian and copper still ran, though more thinly, along the great river arteries. The ceremonial vocabulary of the layered cosmos, of cardinal directions and sacred alignments, was alive in the practices of countless local communities. All of these threads were lying loose in the cultural fabric of the eastern woodlands, waiting for some hand or some moment to gather them up and weave them into a single dense, audacious knot. That moment was approaching. It was approaching with the slow inevitability of a river finding the lowest ground. And the place where it would finally happen, the place where centuries of preparation would suddenly compress into the lifetime of a single generation, was already in motion, already gathering its breath, already beginning to glow faintly in the floodplain where the great waters met. There is a phrase that archaeologists who study Cahokia sometimes use, half in seriousness and half in something like awe, when they try to describe what happened in the American bottom around the middle of the 11th century. They call it the Big Bang. The phrase is borrowed, of course, from cosmology, from the moment when the universe is said to have erupted out of a single dense point into the vast complexity of everything. To use such language for a human settlement might seem extravagant, even fanciful, and yet anyone who looks closely at the evidence in the soil, who reads the stratified layers of construction and abandonment that the excavators have peeled back over the past several decades, comes away with the unsettled sense that no other word quite fits. Something genuinely strange happened in this floodplain. Something happened too quickly to be easily explained. For centuries before that moment, life in the American bottom had followed a recognizable pattern. Small villages were scattered across the high ground above the floods. Garden plots crept along the terraces. Modest mounds rose here and there, marking the places where ancestors had been honoured, or where the local communities gathered for ceremonies that had been performed in similar form for generations. The pace of change was slow, the rhythm familiar. Houses were built, occupied, abandoned, rebuilt nearby. New mounds were added gradually. Over the course of decades or centuries, population grew, but it grew the way most populations grow, by small increments, by the steady accumulation of births over deaths, with the occasional disruption of a hard winter or a bad flood. Then, somewhere around the year 1050, that pattern broke. It did not break gently. It did not break in the way that historical changes are usually described in textbooks, with a slow accumulation of factors that gradually tip a society into a new configuration. The radiocarbon dates, the layered floors of houses, the burned and rebuilt structures of mounds all point to something far more abrupt. Within what appears to have been the span of a single human lifetime, perhaps even less, the floodplain transformed. Existing villages were not gradually abandoned. They were levelled. Old mounds were not slowly enlarged. They were capped and reshaped, their previous summits buried beneath fresh layers of earth, as if the new builders wished to start clean. The ground itself was scraped, regraded, prepared as if for a single coordinated project of staggering ambition. And then, almost immediately in the language of the soil, the city began to rise. This is the kind of evidence that resists easy interpretation. A slow growth, a gradual transformation, a population doubling over the course of 2 or 3 centuries. These are patterns that fit comfortably within the standard explanations of how human societies change. But what the archaeologists found at Cahokia was none of these things. They found instead the unmistakable signature of a decision. Someone, or some group of someones, had decided to build a city. The decision had been made deliberately, on a scale that involved tens of thousands of people, and it had been carried out with a speed that suggests not slow accretion but coordinated action. House compounds went up in regular alignments. Plazas were levelled into precise rectangles. Mounds were begun in calculated locations. The whole layout, when it is mapped against the cardinal directions and the celestial alignments, reveals a degree of planning that is difficult to reconcile with any notion of accidental urbanization. This raises a question that has not yet been satisfactorily answered, despite decades of scholarly attention. What was the catalyst? What happened in the floodplain, or perhaps in the wider cultural world of the Eastern continent, that made it possible, even necessary, for so many people to converge on a single point and to begin, almost simultaneously, to reshape the earth on a scale that no one in this land had ever attempted before? Several possibilities have been offered, none of them entirely satisfying. Climate certainly played a role. The decades around 1050 appear to have been favourable for maize cultivation in the American bottom, with reliable rainfall and long growing seasons that allowed surplus production at a level perhaps unprecedented in the region. Surplus, as has already been noted, makes concentration possible. It allows people to live in dense settlements without immediately starving, but surplus alone does not explain why people would choose to leave their dispersed villages and gather into a single ambitious project. Surplus is a necessary condition, not a sufficient one. A second possibility, harder to pin down but perhaps more compelling, lies in the realm of belief. Something seems to have shifted in the cosmological imagination of the eastern woodlands during the decades just before the Big Bang. New motifs began to appear in the material record, particular ways of decorating pottery, specific iconographic themes involving the sky and the underworld and the axis between them. The frequency and the geographic spread of these motifs increased sharply just before and during the period of Cahokia's rapid growth. Some scholars have suggested that what occurred in the American bottom was not merely an economic concentration, but a religious one. A new vision of how the cosmos was structured, of how human communities could anchor themselves at the center of that structure, may have been emerging. And if such a vision was indeed crystallizing, then Cahokia was perhaps not just a city in the ordinary sense. It was a sacred experiment, an attempt to build a place where the upper world, the middle world, and the lower world could meet and be held in proper alignment by the labor and the devotion of an entire population. There are even hints, though they remain controversial, that something specific may have triggered the awakening. In the year 1054, skywatchers across much of the world recorded the sudden appearance of a brilliant new star in the constellation that the Chinese called Tianguan, the Heavenly Gate. The star was so bright that for several weeks it was visible even in daylight, and it lingered in the night sky for nearly 2 years before fading. Modern astronomers have identified the event as the supernova explosion that produced what is now called the Crab Nebula. It is at least possible, some researchers have argued, that this dramatic celestial event was witnessed in the floodplain of the American bottom, that it was interpreted as a sign of cosmic change, and that it contributed to the urgency with which the new city was conceived and built. Whether or not such a connection can ever be proven, the timing is suggestive. Something happened in the heavens, something happened on the earth, and the people of the floodplain, watching both, decided that the time had come to build. Among everything that the people of the floodplain raised during those decades of frenzied building, one structure stood and still stands, apart from all the others. It dominated the landscape then. It dominates the landscape now, even after centuries of erosion and neglect, even after the modern interstate highways have cut their concrete paths across the bottomland and the suburbs of a faraway city have crept toward its base. The earthen pyramid that archaeologists call Monks Mound, named not for any indigenous association but for a small community of French Trappist monks who briefly farmed its terraces in the early 19th century, is one of the largest earthworks ever constructed by human hands anywhere on the planet. Its base covers roughly 14 acres. Its height reaches more than 30 meters, the equivalent of a 10-story building. Its volume, when measured in basket loads of carried earth, runs into the millions. To stand at its foot today and look up its steep grassy flank is to feel something that the modern mind has trouble naming. It is not the awe of looking at stone, the way one feels at the base of a great cathedral or before the smooth limestone face of a Mesoamerican temple. The mound is made of dirt. It is made of the same brown soil that lies beneath every footstep one has taken to reach it. And yet, it rises. It rises with a presence so unexpected, so out of scale with everything around it, that the mind keeps trying to translate it into something it is not. A hill, perhaps, sculpted by some forgotten geological accident. A natural rise that the ancient builders simply chose to occupy. The textbooks of an earlier era often suggested exactly this, that no indigenous society of North America could have constructed such a thing, that the mound must have been built by some lost race, some vanished civilization of mound builders unrelated to the peoples who later inhabited the continent. It was a comforting theory for those who held it. It was also, like so many comforting theories about the deep American past, entirely wrong. The mound was built layer by careful layer by the people who lived in the city at its base. The evidence is unambiguous. Cores driven into the body of the structure reveal distinct construction stages, each one separated from the next by a buried surface where rain and weather had briefly worked on the exposed earth before fresh fill was added. Different soils were used for different purposes, the choice of each layer reflecting an understanding of how earth behaves under stress. Sticky clay in some places to shed water and resist erosion, more porous loam in others to allow controlled drainage, sod blocks laid with the grass side outward in critical zones so that the roots could knit the slopes together as they grew. None of this is the work of a vanished superior race. It is the work of an indigenous people who had inherited centuries of practical knowledge about how to move and shape soil, and who applied that knowledge with a patience and a precision that still impresses the engineers who study it today. Yet the engineering, however remarkable, is only the surface of what Monks Mound represents. Each basket of earth that was carried up the rising slopes had been gathered from somewhere. Across the city and beyond it, vast borrow pits were dug, sometimes deep enough to fill with water and become permanent ponds, the negative spaces left behind by the positive labour of construction. A person standing at the borrow pit scooping wet clay into a woven basket, perhaps weighing 30 or 40 pounds when full, then walking back across the plaza, then climbing the ramps that led up the side of the growing mound, then dumping the load and turning to walk back, then doing the same again and again and again. Now multiply that single repetition by hundreds of thousands. Multiply it by the years and decades during which the mound was being built and rebuilt and enlarged. The arithmetic of labour becomes almost difficult to hold in the mind. This was not a project. It was a way of life, sustained across generations, woven into the seasonal rhythms of the city itself. What did it mean to participate in such labour? This is one of the questions that the mound, in all its silent vastness, refuses to fully answer. There is a temptation, especially among modern observers shaped by the histories of slave-built pyramids and conscripted labourers, to imagine the construction of Monks Mound as a forced enterprise, an extraction of human effort by a coercive elite. But the archaeological evidence does not particularly support such a reading. There are no signs of mass burials of overworked labourers. There are no ditches filled with the bones of those who died in chains. What the evidence suggests instead is something stranger and harder for the modern mind to grasp. Building the mound may have been understood by those who participated in it as a form of devotion, a ritual obligation, an act that was simultaneously practical and sacred, that bound the participants to one another and to the cosmos in ways that transcended the simple economy of labour for wages. In the cosmologies of many indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands, traditions that survived in altered forms long after Cahokia itself had fallen silent, the world was understood as a vertical structure. There was an upper realm of sky beings and birds, and the powers associated with light and order. There was a middle realm where humans and most animals lived, the everyday world of fields and rivers and ordinary time. And there was a lower realm of water and serpents and the dark generative powers that lay beneath the earth's surface. To raise a mound was to construct, in physical form, a connection between these realms. The mound itself became an axis, a place where the three worlds touched. Those who climbed its slopes ascended, in some symbolic sense, from the middle world toward the upper. Those who looked down from its summit could see the entire visible world arranged below them, the floodplains stretching away on all sides, the river glinting in the distance, the smaller mounds and plazas of the city laid out like a model of the cosmos itself. On the summit of Monks Mound, the excavators have found evidence of large structures, post holes and stains in the soil that mark the foundations of buildings whose timbers have long since rotted away. One of these summit buildings, in its later phases, would have measured nearly 30 metres long, the size of a modern airplane hangar. What happened inside such buildings can only be guessed at. Some scholars suggest that they were the residences of a ruling lineage, the elites who governed the city from a height that placed them physically closer to the sky. Others emphasize a possible ritual function, that these summit halls were temples where sacred fires burned and offerings were made, and the deepest ceremonies of the city were performed away from the eyes of the ordinary population. The two readings are perhaps not incompatible. In a society where political authority and ritual responsibility were not sharply separated, the people who lived and worked at the top of Monks Mound may have been both rulers and priests at once, their power flowing as much from their proximity to the sky as from any administrative function they performed below. Below the towering presence of the great mound stretching south toward the inner reaches of the city lay something almost equally astonishing in its own quiet way, though it has rarely received the attention that its scale and intentionality deserve. Where the visitor today walks across what appears to be an ordinary expanse of grassy ground, the soil beneath the surface tells a different story. The Grand Plaza, as the archaeologists came to call it, was not a natural feature of the floodplain. It was made, carefully, deliberately by hands that gathered up irregular ground and smoothed it into a single continuous surface measuring nearly 50 acres, levelled with such precision that even modern surveyors examining its remains have expressed something close to admiration. The labour required for such a levelling is difficult to imagine. The original ground was not flat. It rose and fell in the gentle undulations that any floodplain naturally develops over centuries of seasonal flooding. To turn that uneven surface into a vast, even ceremonial expanse required filling some areas with soil hauled from elsewhere, scraping others down to lower their elevation, and then tamping and compacting the whole until it presented a single unbroken plain stretching from the foot of Monks Mound nearly to the southern edge of the central precinct. Soil scientists who have studied the plaza have found, beneath its modern grass, layers of fill brought in from different parts of the surrounding landscape, mixed and graded with a care that suggests something more than convenient construction. The plaza was not merely a flat space for people to walk on, it was a stage. It was a deliberately prepared surface on which the most important activities of the city's public life were meant to unfold. What activities? The honest answer is that no one entirely knows. There are no surviving accounts, no inscriptions, no oral traditions that can be cleanly mapped onto the precise functions of the Grand Plaza in its prime. But the archaeological evidence offers suggestive hints, scattered across the plaza's surface, in deposits that have been carefully excavated and analysed, are the remains of feasts. Enormous quantities of broken pottery, charred animal bones, the residues of foods consumed in numbers that go far beyond what any household or even any neighbourhood could account for. The serving vessels are often standardised in form, suggesting the kind of mass production that supports large coordinated gatherings. The food remains include species and cuts that point to deliberate selection rather than ordinary consumption. Whatever happened on the plaza, it involved gatherings of thousands of people, eating and drinking together in events that must have been spectacular by any measure. Around the plaza's edges, the city arranged itself in patterns that reveal a startling degree of intentional design. Smaller mounds rose at regular intervals along the perimeter, like markers of some unseen geometry. Long avenues, traceable through subtle differences in soil composition and the alignments of post holes, ran outward from the plaza in directions that correspond, with a precision that cannot be coincidental, to significant points on the horizon. Some of these avenues align with the rising and setting positions of the sun at the solstices. Others appear to point toward important mounds in distant parts of the city, or in the broader landscape beyond it. The layout, taken as a whole, suggests that the plaza was not merely a central gathering space, but the geometric and ceremonial heart of a city that understood itself as a kind of map of the cosmos, with directions and alignments mattering as much as buildings and walls. This is where the strangeness of Cahokia begins to deepen. where the assumptions that modern observers bring to ancient American sites begin to crack. For most of the 20th century, the prevailing view of indigenous societies north of Mexico held that they were essentially small-scale, that they lacked the organizational capacity for large coordinated construction, that any apparent regularities in their settlements could be attributed to local custom rather than deliberate planning. Cahokia, as it was excavated and mapped over the past several decades, has steadily undermined that view. The neighborhoods of the city, when their post holes and house outlines are reconstructed from the patterns visible in the soil, reveal an order that is difficult to reconcile with any notion of accidental urbanization. Houses were aligned along axes that ran north-south and east-west. Courtyards were spaced at regular intervals. The widths of lanes between household compounds tend to fall into repeating patterns. Even the orientations of individual buildings, the direction their doorways faced, follow rules that hold across whole districts of the city. This is the signature of planning, not the loose accumulation of buildings that occurs when families simply settle wherever they find space, but the imposition of a layout, a vision, an idea of how a city should be arranged that someone or some group must have held in mind before the building began. Whose mind? Whose vision? These are questions that the soil cannot directly answer, but the existence of the plan itself raises uncomfortable possibilities. There must have been people in Cahokia, or among its founders, who possessed the authority to direct construction on a citywide scale. People who could decide where neighborhoods would go, where avenues would run, where the great plaza would be leveled and what its dimensions would be. People whose decisions were respected or enforced across thousands of households. The vision of Cahokia as a loosely organized chiefdom, a slightly larger version of the village societies that surrounded it, becomes harder and harder to sustain in the face of evidence like this. Something more centralized, more capable of large-scale coordination must have been operating, and the alignments themselves carry implications that go beyond mere administration. To build a city oriented to the cardinal directions, with avenues that track the solstice sunrises, requires not only authority, but knowledge. Someone in Cahokia, or some group of specialists, knew how to observe the sky with enough precision to lay out a settlement that mirrored its patterns. They knew where the sun would rise on the longest day of the year and on the shortest. They knew how to mark these positions on the horizon and how to translate them into lines drawn across the earth. This is not the kind of knowledge that emerges spontaneously. It is the product of generations of careful observation, of accumulated understanding passed from teacher to student, of an intellectual tradition that has rarely been credited to the indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands by the histories that most modern readers were given. The plaza, then, is more than a flat field. It is a question. It is a question about who the people of Cahokia really were, and what they really knew, and how much of what they accomplished has been quietly written out of the standard narratives of how civilization developed in the Americas. The grass that grows over its surface today gives no hint of what once happened on that ground, but the soil beneath remembers. The leveled fill, the alignments, the post holes of vanished structures, all of it waits patiently for anyone who's willing to ask the right questions and to be unsettled by the answers that begin to emerge. West of the Grand Plaza, beyond the cluster of inner mounds and the densely packed neighborhoods that surrounded the city's ceremonial heart, the excavators of the 20th century stumbled upon something that initially defied easy interpretation. A pattern of post holes arranged in a great circle. The posts themselves had long since rotted away, but the dark stains they left in the soil, where their ancient timbers had decayed and been replaced by darker organic matter, were unmistakable. The circles, for there turned out to be several of them built and rebuilt in slightly different locations across the centuries of the city's life, were enormous. Each one consisted of dozens of massive wooden posts arranged at carefully measured intervals around a central observation point. The largest of them spanned nearly 400 feet in diameter, the size of a small modern stadium. The archaeologists who first encountered these features began calling them, with a slight nervousness about the comparison, woodhenges. The name was meant partly as a joke, partly as a placeholder. The reference to the great stone circles of Britain was inevitable, and yet it carried the risk of suggesting a connection that no one was prepared to defend. There is no evidence that the builders of Cahokia knew anything about Stonehenge, or about the megalithic traditions of the Old World. The woodhenges of the American bottom were almost certainly an independent invention, a local response to the same impulses that had driven so many other human societies in so many other parts of the world to mark the passage of time by setting upright timbers or stones in carefully measured rings. What the name captured, despite its lightness, was the genuine astonishment that the discovery provoked. Here, in the heart of a city that earlier generations had been told could not have existed, was a structure that seemed to track the movements of the sun with the same kind of precision that the great megalithic observatories of prehistoric Europe had once tracked. When the alignments of the posts were carefully measured and projected against the horizon, the patterns that emerged were too consistent to be dismissed as coincidence. From the central observation point, sightlines ran outward towards specific posts that aligned with remarkable accuracy with the rising sun on the equinoxes, on the summer solstice, on the winter solstice. Other posts may have marked additional astronomical events, perhaps the lunar standstills that occur only every 18.5 years, perhaps the heliacal risings of certain stars whose appearance signalled the changing of the seasons. The exact functions of every post remain debated, but the basic conclusion is no longer seriously disputed. The people of Cahokia were watching the sky. They were watching it with sufficient care to construct, in wood, an instrument that could track the sun's annual journey across the horizon with the kind of accuracy that only sustained generational observation can achieve. What did such observation mean to those who performed it? This is where the questions begin to deepen, and where the modern habit of separating science from religion becomes an obstacle to understanding. For the people of Cahokia, almost certainly, watching the sky was not a separate intellectual activity, divorced from the rest of life. It was a sacred act. The sun's movements were not abstract astronomical phenomena. They were the visible signs of cosmic order, the rhythm by which the upper world communicated with the middle world, the calendar that told the priests and the planners and the ordinary farmers when to plant and when to harvest, and when to gather for the great ceremonies that renewed the bonds between earth and sky. To know where the sun would rise on a particular day was to participate in the structure of the cosmos itself. To stand in the centre of Woodhenge as the first light broke over a precisely chosen post on the horizon was to witness, and perhaps to confirm, that the world was still working as it should. This kind of knowledge confers a particular kind of power. It is the power of prediction. In a society where the timing of agricultural activities is critical, where planting too early invites a late frost and planting too late invites the failure of the harvest before winter, the person who can reliably predict the changing of the seasons becomes indispensable. But the power of the Cahokian skywatchers, if such people existed in any organized form, would have gone far beyond practical agriculture. To stand at the center of a great wooden circle and to announce with perfect accuracy that the sun would rise on a particular morning at a particular point on the horizon was to demonstrate a mastery of cosmic timing that ordinary people could neither verify nor contest. It was to perform in the most public and visible way possible the claim that those who organized the city were in tune with the order of the universe. The implications of this are quietly enormous. Authority in Cahokia, whatever its precise structure, seems to have been bound up with the ability to read the sky. The leaders who lived on top of Monks Mound, who oversaw the construction of plazas and the running of avenues, who commanded the labour of tens of thousands of basket carriers, were not merely administrators or chiefs in the ordinary sense. They were, or they claimed to be, the keepers of cosmic alignment. Their legitimacy rested not only on their ability to organize society, but on their apparent ability to mediate between the visible world and the unseen forces that governed it. When such legitimacy holds, a city like Cahokia becomes possible. When it begins to crack, when the predictions fail or the rains do not come or the floods overwhelm the carefully tended fields despite all the proper ceremonies, the entire structure begins to tremble in ways that cannot be repaired by any merely political adjustment. There is something deeply unsettling about contemplating the implications. In the official histories of how knowledge developed in the Americas, the indigenous peoples north of Mexico have rarely been credited with sophisticated astronomy. The great calendrical achievements of the Maya, the precise observations of the Aztec, the intricate sky knowledge of the Andean cultures, all of these have been acknowledged, if sometimes grudgingly. But the woodlands peoples of the north, in the standard accounts, were portrayed as practical agriculturalists, capable perhaps of noting the seasons but not of constructing observatories or tracking celestial cycles with any rigour. Cahokia's wood henges and the alignments of its plazas and avenues suggest that this picture was always wrong. The knowledge was here. It was embodied in wood rather than stone, and the wood has long since decayed, leaving only the faint stains of post holes for later archaeologists to puzzle over. But the knowledge itself was as real and as carefully preserved across generations as anything that the chroniclers of the Old World ever recorded. What else, one cannot help but ask, has been quietly written out of the story? What other forms of indigenous knowledge have decayed into invisibility because they were not preserved in stone or paper, because the archives that held them were oral, embodied, sky-watched and lost when the people who carried them were scattered or silenced? Cahokia, with its rotted timbers and its dark-stained earth, offers no easy answer. It only stands, faintly, as a witness to how much may have been forgotten. The city did not feed itself only on the maize of its own fields, nor did it draw its meaning only from the sky above its plazas. To walk through Cahokia at the height of its life, to enter the workshops where artisans bent over their craft, to step into the chambers where the highest-ranking dead were laid out for burial, was to walk through a place that pulled in materials from a continent. The objects that the excavators have recovered from Cahokian contexts read like a quiet inventory of impossible distances. Copper, hammered into ornaments and ritual blades, carrying still the faint chemical signature of the ancient veins around Lake Superior, more than 1,000 miles to the north. Marine shells, some carved into cups, others drilled and strung as beads, gathered originally from the warm coasts of the Gulf of Mexico, hundreds of miles to the south. Mica, peeled into translucent leaves that catch the light like frozen water, originating in the mountains of the southern Appalachians far to the east. Specific kinds of fine-grained stone, prized for the long razor-edge blades that Cahokian flint knappers worked into ceremonial implements, traced back to quarries in the western prairies in the uplands of what would become Oklahoma and Arkansas. None of these things walked themselves to the city. Each piece of copper, each shell, each leaf of mica had to be carried by someone across distances that took weeks of travel. The mechanisms of that movement remain partly obscured, but the broad outline is clear enough. The river systems that converged near the American bottom served as the primary highways. A canoe loaded with goods could travel from the upper Mississippi or down the Ohio in a fraction of the time that any overland route would have required. Portages between river systems, well known to those who use them regularly, allowed traders to cross from one watershed to another with minimal difficulty. Goods flowed along these arteries the way blood flows through a body, in steady patterns that connected distant communities into a single circulatory system. And Cahokia, sitting at the geographic heart of that system, drew on it like a heart drawing in blood. The objects themselves are only the visible residue of what must have been a much richer flow. Behind every piece of copper lay a relationship, a series of agreements between communities along the route by which it travelled. Behind every marine shell lay a network of obligations, of trade understandings, of ceremonial exchanges that had been negotiated and renegotiated across generations. Some of those relationships were probably commercial in a relatively recognizable sense, with goods exchanged for goods according to accepted equivalences. Others were almost certainly bound up in marriage alliances, with young women and men travelling between communities to seal kinship ties that would, in turn, keep the trade routes open. Still others operated through the medium of ritual, with prestige objects circulating as gifts between leaders, accumulating layers of meaning as they passed from hand to hand. The objects were not merely commodities, they were vessels of relationship, and the relationships they carried were what truly held the network together. There is something almost vertiginous about contemplating the geographic reach of Cahokia's connections. From the perspective of the older histories, the indigenous peoples of pre-Columbian North America were often portrayed as living in relatively isolated communities, with limited contact beyond their immediate neighbours. The picture that emerges from the Cahokian evidence is radically different. It suggests a continent that was in its own way deeply connected, not by roads in the European sense, not by written contracts or imperial decrees, but by the patient accumulation of trade relationships, marriage networks, ceremonial alliances, and shared symbolic vocabularies that stretched across thousands of miles. People in the upper Great Lakes knew, in some form, what was happening in the floodplain of the Mississippi. People on the Gulf Coast received, in their own communities, echoes of the styles and motifs that originated at the great city to the north. The continent was not a collection of isolated tribes. It was a web, and Cahokia was one of its largest and most active knots. What flowed along these threads was not only material, it was also meaning. Among the objects that have been recovered from Cahokian contexts, certain motifs appear again and again, carved into shell, hammered into copper, painted onto pottery, embedded in the elaborate iconography of ceremonial regalia. Birds of prey, often shown with their wings spread in attitudes of striking power. Human figures wearing distinctive headdresses, sometimes with markings around their eyes that scholars have come to associate with a complex of meanings linked to the upper world. Cross shapes inscribed in circles, possibly representing the four cardinal directions held within the wholeness of the cosmos. Serpentine figures, sometimes horned or winged, that seem to belong to the lower world of water and powerful generative forces. These motifs, taken together, form what scholars have come to call with appropriate caution the Southeastern ceremonial complex. It is a loose family of symbols and ritual practices that appears across an enormous geographic range, from the upper Midwest to the Gulf Coast, from the Atlantic seaboard to the eastern edge of the prairies. The relationship between Cahokia and this broader symbolic world is one of the more intriguing puzzles that the archaeologists have inherited. In some cases, motifs that first appear in elaborated form at Cahokia seem to spread outward. showing up later in slightly altered versions at distant mound centres. In other cases, motifs that may have originated elsewhere appear at Cahokia in their fullest expressions, as if the city had become a place where ideas from across the continent were gathered, refined, and broadcast back outward in new forms. The directions of influence are not always clear. What is clear is that Cahokia stood at the centre of a symbolic network as much as a material one, and that the meanings carried by its prestige objects were as important as the substances of which they were made. When such objects entered the city, they did not circulate freely. They were concentrated deliberately in the hands of those who held high status. The graves of certain individuals at Cahokia have yielded astonishing assemblages of trade goods, copper plates, sheets of mica, strings of marine shell beads numbering in the thousands, finely crafted stone tools, all gathered around bodies that had been treated with extraordinary care. Other burials, by contrast, contain little or nothing. The contrast is stark, and it tells a story that earlier views of egalitarian indigenous societies had no comfortable way to accommodate. Cahokia was not a society of equals. It was a society in which some people had access to the marvels of a continent and others did not. The flow of distant goods, by gathering in the hands of the few, marked out lines of authority and difference that ran through every aspect of the city's life. Those lines, as the centuries would eventually reveal, carried within them not only the prestige that held the city together, but also the tensions that would, in time, contribute to its quiet undoing. Somewhere around the late 12th century, perhaps a little earlier, the people of Cahokia made a decision that altered the appearance of their city in a way no visitor could have failed to notice. They began to build a wall. Not a wall in the modern sense, not a permanent stone barrier with gates and towers laid into mortared courses, but a long curving palisade of upright wooden posts, each one cut from a substantial tree, each one set shoulder to shoulder with its neighbours in a trench dug for that purpose. The wall did not enclose the entire city. The outlying neighbourhoods, the suburban sprawl that stretched along the bluffs and bottomlands for miles in every direction, were left outside its protection. What the wall enclosed was the ceremonial heart, the precinct around Monks Mound and the grand plaza, and the cluster of mounds that surrounded them. It enclosed, in other words, the place where the rulers and the priests and the most important rituals of the city resided, and it did so with an unmistakable air of urgency. The construction of such a wall represents an enormous investment of labour. Estimates of the number of trees that had to be felled, hauled, trimmed, and set into the ground run into the tens of thousands. The trench in which the post stood was itself a substantial excavation, dug by crews who must have been organised and directed by someone with the authority to require their participation. And the wall was not built once and left standing. The archaeologists have identified at least 4 distinct phases of construction and rebuilding, spread across roughly a century of the city's later life. Each phase involved tearing down or removing the previous wall and replacing it with a new one, sometimes following the same line, sometimes shifting slightly to accommodate changes in what the builders wished to enclose. The repetition of this immense labour, the willingness to invest such resources not once but 4 times over, suggests that whatever motivated the wall's construction was not a passing concern. It was a sustained anxiety, a persistent feature of life in the late city. What was that anxiety? The most straightforward answer is that the wall was meant to defend against attack. Walls, after all, exist to keep things out. And there are details of the palisade's construction that support this reading. At regular intervals along the wall's length, the post holes reveal the foundations of bastions, projecting structures that would have allowed defenders to fire arrows along the face of the wall, catching attackers in crossfire as they approached. Gates appear to have been narrow and easily defensible, designed to funnel any incoming force into spaces where they could be controlled. Arrowheads have been found in the trenches of the palisade itself, sometimes embedded in patterns that suggest they were fired from outside the wall toward the city. None of this proves that any particular battle ever occurred at Cahokia, but it suggests with considerable force that the people who built and rebuilt the palisade believed that the possibility of attack was real enough to justify their immense expenditure of effort. Yet the palisade is more puzzling than a simple defensive structure would imply. If the goal was to protect the city, why protect only the inner precinct? Why leave the outlying neighborhoods, where the great majority of the population lived, exposed beyond the wall's reach? The answer may be that the palisade was not only, or even primarily, defensive in the military sense. It may also have been a statement, a line drawn in wood and earth that separated different kinds of space. To pass through one of its gates was to leave the ordinary city behind and enter a different zone, a precinct of heightened sacredness and tighter authority. Inside the wall, certain rituals took place. Certain people walked, certain decisions were made. Outside, the rhythms of daily life continued. The wall may have been less about keeping enemies out than about keeping the boundary between inside and outside visible, repeatedly renewed by the labour of rebuilding. Both readings can be true at the same time. A wall that marks ceremonial boundaries can also serve defensive purposes, and a wall that defends against external threats can also reinforce internal hierarchies. What the palisade tells the modern observer, in either case, is that something had changed in Cahokia. The early phases of the city, when construction had been driven by an apparently confident expansion, had not required such defences. The later phases, when the wall went up and was repeatedly rebuilt, suggest a community that had become more inward, more concerned with protection, more aware of threats either from beyond its borders or from within its own population. Confidence had given way to caution. Whatever optimistic vision had once driven the Big Bang had been replaced by something tighter, more anxious, more guarded. Other lines of evidence corroborate this shift. Skeletal remains from late Cahokia and from sites in the surrounding region show traces of violence that earlier centuries had not displayed in the same proportions. Healed fractures consistent with blows from clubs, embedded arrow points found among the bones of those who had not survived their wounds, skulls with depression fractures that mark the moment when a final blow ended a life. Some sites in the broader Mississippian world from this period show even more disturbing evidence. Villages burned and abandoned, skeletons left unburied in postures that suggest sudden massacre, defensive features hastily constructed in places that had previously felt no need for them. Cahokia itself does not display the unambiguous signs of a single catastrophic battle, but it shows the pattern of a society in which violence had become a more frequent presence than it had been before. Among the most disturbing finds from Cahokian contexts is a particular burial complex, often referred to in the literature by its excavation number as Mound 72. The central interment in this complex is a high-status individual, laid out on a remarkable platform of more than 20,000 carefully arranged marine shell beads. Around this central burial, in a series of nearby pits, the excavators found other human remains arranged in patterns that resist any innocent interpretation. Multiple young women, mostly in their late teens or early 20s, laid out in carefully ordered rows. Other individuals, some of them showing signs of having been killed by violent means, tumbled into pits in less orderly fashion. The total number of bodies associated with the burial runs into the hundreds. The implications, when they are stated plainly, are difficult to absorb. Some of these people, perhaps many of them, did not die naturally. They appear to have been killed as part of the ceremonies surrounding the death of an important figure, their lives offered up to accompany the high-status dead into whatever realm awaited beyond the visible world. Whether such killings were experienced by the participants as honour or as horror, whether the victims went willingly or were forced, the bones themselves cannot tell. They can only mark in their silent arrangement that something had hardened in the spiritual life of the city. The cost of maintaining cosmic order had begun to be paid, at least sometimes, in human blood. Decline, when it comes to a great civilization, rarely arrives the way the imagination expects it to arrive. There is no single morning when the people of a city wake up and decide that everything is over. There is no decisive battle, no plague that sweeps through in a single season, no volcanic eruption that buries the streets in ash. What happens instead almost always is something far more difficult to perceive from inside the experience of those living through it. Things slow down. Projects that would have been completed in earlier decades remain unfinished. Plans that would once have galvanized the entire community are quietly abandoned. The rhythm of daily life continues, more or less, and yet underneath the surface a kind of drift sets in, a slow loosening of the bonds that had once held everything together. By the time anyone notices clearly that the Great Age has passed, it has already been passing for a very long time. This is what the archaeological evidence suggests happened at Cahokia. Beginning sometime in the 13th century, perhaps a little earlier in some areas, the signature patterns of vigorous construction begin to soften. Mounds that had been growing through regular phases of enlargement reach a certain height and stop. Summit buildings that would once have been rebuilt at the slightest sign of decay are allowed to stand longer between renovations, or are not rebuilt at all when they finally collapse. Neighbourhoods that had been densely packed begin to thin, with houses being abandoned and not replaced, with empty pads where dwellings had once stood now, reverting slowly to weeds and small trees. The city does not empty all at once. It empties in patches, in patterns that vary from precinct to precinct, with some areas shrinking earlier than others, and a few perhaps even seeing brief late surges of activity before they too quiet down. Taken together, the evidence describes not a collapse but an unravelling. The threads that had held Cahokia together do not snap. They loosen what was loosening them. The honest answer again is that no single explanation accounts for everything that the soil reveals, and the modern researchers who've spent their careers studying the city tend to speak instead of multiple converging pressures, each of which would have been manageable on its own, but which together produced an effect that the city's social and political structures could not absorb. Climate appears to have been one of these pressures. The centuries during which Cahokia rose had been, on the whole, favourable for maize agriculture in the American bottom. The centuries during which it declined coincided with a series of climatic shifts that made the floodplain a less reliable provider. Tree ring records from across the eastern continent suggest that the years between roughly 1200 and 1350 were marked by greater unpredictability in rainfall, with periods of drought alternating with periods of unusually heavy precipitation. Pollen records from lakes near the city show shifts in the dominant plant communities that point to drier conditions in some intervals, wetter in others, neither lasting long enough to allow the agricultural system to fully adapt. The floods, when they came, may have been particularly devastating. Sediment cores taken from the floodplain reveal layers of river silt that cap older occupation deposits in patterns, suggesting that several major flood events swept across portions of the American bottom during the city's later history. To the modern observer, accustomed to flood insurance and emergency management, it is easy to imagine such events as temporary setbacks. To the people of Cahokia, who had invested years of labour into clearing fields, building houses, digging storage pits, and accumulating the social relationships that gave their lives meaning. A flood that buried the work of a generation under several feet of mud would have been something far more profound. It would have been a sign. The same waters that had once enriched the soil with their seasonal gifts were now, for reasons that the ceremonies and the alignments and the accumulated wisdom of the priest could not seem to address, behaving in ways that defied the old patterns. The cosmos, in a sense, was no longer holding. Drought presented a different but related problem. Maize, the foundation of the city's food supply, is a thirsty crop. A few seasons of poor rainfall would not destroy the system, but a longer pattern of dry years would gradually erode the surplus that made urban concentration possible. When yields fall, when the granaries are not as full as they once were, the careful arithmetic of feeding a dense population begins to fail. People grow hungry, children weaken. The labour required to maintain the great public projects becomes harder to extract from a population that is now spending more of its energy simply trying to eat. And the leaders who had built their authority on the claim that they could mediate between the people and the cosmos find themselves in an awkward position. The droughts continue, the floods recur, the ceremonies are performed, the alignments are renewed, the offerings are made, and yet the rains do not come, or come too violently, and the harvests do not match what the elders remember from their own youth. There is something almost philosophical about this kind of crisis. It is not only an economic crisis, although it is that. It is also a crisis of meaning. A society organized around the claim that its rituals keep the world in order will, when the world begins to fall out of order despite the rituals, face a question that no amount of additional ritual can fully answer. Were the ceremonies wrong? Were they performed incorrectly? Did the leaders lose their connection to the powers that had once listened to them? Or more disturbing still, were the powers themselves no longer what they had been, no longer interested in the offerings of these particular people, no longer willing to maintain the bargain that had sustained the city for so long? Such questions, once they begin to circulate, are corrosive in ways that are hard to repair. They eat slowly at the foundations of authority, not by overthrowing it dramatically, but by quietly draining it of the certainty that it requires to function. Other pressures compounded the climatic ones. The forests around Cahokia, which had supplied the timber for everything from house frames to ceremonial posts to the great palisades, would have been steadily diminished by centuries of intensive use. Each rebuilding of the wall, each reconstruction of a summit building, each new stand of houses for a growing neighbourhood drew on a finite resource that was not being replenished at the rate of consumption. By the late centuries of the city's life, the trees that remained would have stood farther from the urban core, requiring longer hauls and greater effort to bring back. This kind of slow ecological depletion does not announce itself dramatically. It simply makes everything slightly harder, year after year, until the cumulative effect becomes impossible to ignore. Combined with the climatic shifts, with the recurring floods, with the gradual erosion of confidence in the leadership that had once seemed unshakable, it created the conditions under which a city of tens of thousands of people could begin, almost without anyone deciding it to come undone. There is a question that hovers over every decline, and it is a question that grows more pressing the closer one looks at the evidence. Why did the people leave? Not in the abstract, not as a historical process visible only in retrospect, but in the immediate sense of individual families gathering their belongings and walking away from houses that their grandparents had built. The decision to leave a place where one's ancestors are buried, where the rhythms of life have been established across generations, where every familiar landmark carries a story, is not a small decision. It is wrenching. It involves the abandonment of investments that no one can fully recover. And yet at Cahokia, over the course of perhaps a century and a half, the people did leave. They left in numbers great enough that what had once been the largest city north of Mexico became, by the time the first European explorers reached the region centuries later, an empty landscape of grassy mounds whose true significance no one could explain. The factors that drove this departure must have been many, and they must have varied from household to household, from neighbourhood to neighbourhood. But several lines of evidence point to pressures that would have weighed on almost everyone in the late city, regardless of their particular circumstances. The most fundamental of these pressures was probably disease. In any dense human settlement, especially one where waste accumulates in pits and where standing water collects after every flood, infections that might burn out quickly in scattered villages can find conditions that allow them to spread, recur, and become entrenched. The bones of children from late Cahokian contexts show signs of biological stress that suggest a population struggling under chronic health pressures. Enamel defects on teeth, marking episodes of severe illness or malnutrition during early childhood. Lesions on the surfaces of bones that point to long battles with infections that the body never quite defeated. Stunted growth patterns that indicate generations of children who never reached the full stature their genes had set for them. None of this proves a single catastrophic epidemic, but it sketches a population whose health was gradually being eroded by the very conditions of urban life. To this picture must be added the cumulative effects of environmental degradation. Centuries of intensive agriculture in the floodplain had begun to exhaust even the rich bottomland soils. Centuries of fuel gathering had thinned the forests on the bluffs. Centuries of hunting had reduced the populations of deer and other game that had once provided crucial protein during seasons when the maize stores ran low. Each of these depletions, taken alone, might have been recoverable. Together, they meant that the safety net beneath the urban population had grown steadily thinner. When the climate shifted and the harvest failed, there were fewer wild resources to fall back on. When disease struck, there were fewer reserves of strength to draw upon. The margins of survival, which had once been comfortable enough to support the elaborate ceremonies and the monumental construction projects of the early city, had narrowed to the point where every additional pressure became a crisis. But the deepest pressure, perhaps, was a pressure that leaves no clear archaeological signature. It was a pressure of belief. A city like Cahokia is not held together only by economics and politics. It is held together by a shared conviction that the place itself matters, that the labour invested in its mounds and plazas is meaningful, that the ceremonies performed at its centre are doing something real and necessary in the order of the cosmos. When that conviction begins to falter, when the leaders who had once seemed to embody cosmic legitimacy now seem to be merely men, when the ceremonies performed at the great mound no longer produced the rains and the harvests they had once seemed to summon, the entire structure begins to feel hollow. The labour that had once felt like devotion begins to feel like obligation and then like exploitation. The privileges of the elite, which had once been understood as appropriate to their cosmic role, begin to look like injustice. The centre, in the most literal sense, no longer holds. In this kind of slow loss of faith, leaders face a difficult choice. They can intensify the spectacle, calling for renewed building, more elaborate ceremonies, perhaps even more dramatic sacrifices, in the hope of convincing both the population and the powers above that the old order still works. There are hints in the late archaeological record of exactly this kind of intensification, of brief bursts of construction or ritual activity that may represent attempts to shore up confidence that was already failing. Or leaders can experiment blending new symbols and new alliances into the older system, trying to find some adaptive combination that might allow authority to continue under different conditions. There are hints of this kind of experimentation as well, of foreign motifs and new burial practices appearing in the late city alongside older traditions. Either response, intensification, or experimentation carries risks. Intensification can deepen the very alienation that it tries to address by demanding more from a population that is already exhausted. Experimentation can fragment the symbolic vocabulary that had once unified the community, leaving it without a coherent center to hold to. What seems to have happened at Cahokia is that neither response succeeded. The intensifications, when they were attempted, did not restore the old confidence. The experiments, when they were tried, did not produce a new synthesis stable enough to anchor a renewed urban life. And so, family by family, lineage by lineage, the population of the city began to thin. Some moved up the river toward the upper Mississippi country, where rich bottomlands and lower population densities offered a fresh start. Some moved down the river toward the southern reaches of the Mississippian world, where other mound centers were rising or already established. Some moved east into the Ohio Valley, west into the prairies, north into the country of the Great Lakes. The directions varied, but the pattern was consistent. People were leaving the floodplain and taking with them what they could carry of their stories, their tools, their ritual knowledge, their kinship ties. They were not vanishing. They were redistributing themselves across a continent, becoming the ancestors of communities that would persist long after Cahokia itself had fallen silent. For those who remained behind through the long late phases of the city's life, the experience must have been strange in ways that are difficult to fully imagine. To live in a place that had once been crowded with thousands of voices, that had once hummed with the energy of festivals and construction and trade, and to watch that place slowly empty around them, neighborhood by neighborhood, mound by abandoned mound, would have required a kind of endurance that no modern parallel quite captures. They were not living through a catastrophe. They were living through an absence that was slowly becoming larger than the presence that had preceded it. And eventually, when the last households finally chose to leave, when the smoke stopped rising from the last hearths and the wind blew unimpeded across plazas where ceremonies had once gathered the multitudes, the city did not die so much as it returned to silence. The same silence that had held the floodplain before the Big Bang first broke it open nearly 4 centuries earlier. The departure of the people from Cahokia was not the end of their story. It was only the end of one particular configuration of their story, the chapter in which they had gathered into a single great urban experiment in the floodplain of the great rivers. Beyond that chapter, the lives continued. The families who left did not dissolve into myth or vanish into some unreachable past. They moved, settled, intermarried, adapted, and carried with them, often in ways that they themselves may not have fully understood, the inheritance of the city they had left behind. To trace this inheritance is to follow threads that scatter across an entire continent, threads that grow thinner and harder to identify the further they travel from the original source, but threads that nonetheless persist, woven into the fabric of communities and traditions that survive into the present day. The most visible of these threads appears in the rise of other Mississippian centers in the centuries after Cahokia's peak. Across the eastern continent, in places that had previously known smaller-scale settlement, new towns began to develop a recognizable family resemblance to the great city in the American bottom. They built platform mounds arranged around plazas. They organized themselves into chiefdoms with hierarchical authority structures. They participated in the wide-ranging exchange networks that moved copper and shell and ceremonial objects across enormous distances. Some of these centers, like Moundville in the river valleys of what is now Alabama, grew to substantial size and exerted considerable influence over their surrounding regions. Others, like Etowah in the Georgia uplands, like Spiro in the eastern reaches of what would become Oklahoma, like Angel Mounds along the Ohio River, served as significant nodes in their respective territories. None of them rivaled Cahokia at its height, but all of them carried, in their layouts and their ceremonies and their material cultures, traces of the symbolic vocabulary that had been so fully elaborated in the floodplain to the north. The relationship between these later centres and Cahokia itself is one of the more delicate puzzles that scholars have inherited. It would be too simple to call them daughter cities, as if their populations had migrated directly from Cahokia in a single mass movement. The reality was almost certainly more complex. People from Cahokia did move outward as the city declined, and some of them surely settled in regions where mound centres were arising. But these new centres also drew on their own deep local traditions, on indigenous histories that had developed independently before Cahokia rose and continued to develop after it fell. What appears in the archaeological record is not a simple parent-child relationship, but a kind of cultural conversation in which influences flowed in multiple directions, in which Cahokian motifs were adopted and adapted by communities that integrated them into their own existing frameworks. The result was a Mississippian world that was more diverse, more locally inflected, more genuinely shared than any single source explanation can fully capture. Beyond the visible monuments, there were less tangible inheritances. Stories carried by departing families would have travelled with them, retold around new hearths in new places, gradually transforming as they passed through generations who had no direct memory of the great city itself. Songs would have crossed rivers and prairies, their words and melodies bending to fit new languages and new contexts. Ceremonial knowledge, the practical understanding of how to align a plaza with the solstice or how to read the appearance of certain stars as signals of the changing seasons, would have been preserved in the bodies and minds of those who carried it, even when the great wooden circles where it had been embodied had long since rotted into the earth. None of this can be excavated. None of it leaves clear traces in the soil. But the indigenous nations whose ancestral territories overlap with the broader Mississippian world hold, in their own oral traditions and ceremonial practices, echoes of patterns that the archaeologist can only partly reconstruct from material remains. The two ways of knowing do not always align cleanly. They speak in different registers, address different questions, preserve different aspects of what once was. But where they touch, where archaeological evidence and indigenous memory begin to suggest the same shapes, the convergence is worth attending to. It is here that one must move carefully, because the temptation to draw simple lines from ancient cities to modern peoples can do real damage when it overreaches. Indigenous communities are not living museums of pre-contact civilizations. They are living, evolving societies whose histories cannot be reduced to archaeological narratives, however sympathetic. At the same time, the older habit of treating the indigenous past as if it had been frozen at the moment of European contact, as if the centuries before that contact were a static prehistoric backdrop with no internal development, is also a distortion. The truth lies somewhere more complicated, in the recognition that the peoples of the eastern woodlands had long, dynamic, internally varied histories before any European set foot on the continent, and that those histories continued to unfold after Cahokia fell, leaving traces that can be glimpsed in the present, even when the direct connections cannot always be traced. The Osage, the Quapaw, the Ponca, the Omaha, the Kansa, the Ho-Chunk, the Oto, the Missouri, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, the Caddo, and many others hold their own accounts of origins and migrations, their own remembered geographies of mound landscapes and ancestral towns along great rivers. These accounts are not merely echoes of an archaeological past. They are knowledge in their own right, carried by peoples who have continued to live with and on these landscapes, and they deserve respect as something more than corroborating evidence for outsider narratives. The mounds themselves, meanwhile, did not disappear when the city emptied. They remained where they had been built, slowly weathering under wind and rain, slowly being covered by the grasses and trees that crept back across the floodplain when the maize fields were no longer tended. For centuries after the last Cahokian families had left, the mounds stood. They stood as the European explorers and missionaries and settlers eventually approached, and the responses of those newcomers to what they found are themselves a study in the ways that uncomfortable evidence can be explained away. Some early European observers, confronted with mounds whose scale clearly indicated organized labor and substantial population, refused to believe that the indigenous peoples they encountered could possibly have built them. Various theories arose to explain the mounds without crediting their actual creators: lost tribes of Israel, wandering Vikings, a vanished superior race that had been displaced by these supposedly more primitive peoples, whom the colonizers were now in the process of dispossessing. Each of these theories served in its own way to render the deep indigenous past unavailable to the descendants of the people who had lived it, and to justify the continued displacement of those descendants from lands whose ancient histories were now being assigned to imagined other builders. The mounds, in other words, became contested ground in a way that went far beyond their physical presence. What they meant, who had built them, what their existence implied about the indigenous past and the colonial present, all of these became questions whose answers carried political weight. And the silencing of the true story, the erasure of Cahokia from the standard histories of the continent, was not entirely accidental. It served particular interests at particular moments in ways that the careful student of historiography can still reconstruct. What remains when so much has been carried away is the land itself. The floodplain still spreads beneath the great rivers, though the rivers have shifted their channels and the levees built by modern engineers have constrained their seasonal floods to narrower bounds than the ancient floods would have known. The mounds still stand, though many have been damaged or destroyed by the centuries that followed. Of the original constellation of more than 120 mounds that once defined the Cahokian landscape, perhaps 80 survive in any recognizable form, the rest having been ploughed flat by farmers, hauled away as fill for railroad beds, or covered over by the strip malls and subdivisions of a metropolitan region that grew up around them without ever quite seeing them. Monks Mound itself remains, though its slopes have eroded and its summit no longer holds the great timber buildings that once made it the most visible structure on the eastern continent. To stand on its top today is to look out across a landscape that holds, just beneath its modern surface, the buried geometry of a city whose existence was for a long time deliberately forgotten. What does it mean to live among the bones of such a place? This is a question that has no comfortable answer, and perhaps it is not meant to have one. The visitors who come to the surviving mounds today often find themselves moving more slowly than they expected, speaking more quietly than they had planned. Something about the scale of the earthworks, set against the flatness of the surrounding plain, draws the body into a different rhythm. The wind moves across the grass in ways that seem to carry suggestions rather than statements. The birds call from the trees that have grown back along the edges of the old plazas, indifferent to the human histories that lie beneath their roots. The light changes, the shadows shift. The long arc of an afternoon passes, and the mounds remain, holding their silence as they have held it for the better part of 1,000 years. They do not explain themselves. They do not ask to be understood. They simply persist, as they have persisted, as they will continue to persist long after the modern visitors have returned to their cities and their distractions. There is a temptation, when contemplating such places, to reach for the consolations of a tidy moral. The story of Cahokia, told in a certain way, can be made to deliver any number of lessons: a lesson about the fragility of civilizations, a lesson about the dangers of inequality, a lesson about the limits of human ambition in the face of climate and ecology, a lesson about the resilience of indigenous peoples who did not vanish when their great city fell, but adapted and persisted and became the ancestors of nations that endure into the present. All of these lessons are available, and each of them captures some real aspect of what the city was and what its trajectory means. But there is also something resistant in the place, something that does not quite submit to any moral framework that the modern observer might wish to impose on it. The people who built Cahokia were not parables. They were not a cautionary tale or an inspirational example. They were human beings, with their own purposes and their own contradictions, who built something extraordinary, and then, for reasons that no one entirely understands, allowed it to become quiet. Their story, in its full complexity, exceeds anything that can be neatly drawn from it. What lingers, perhaps, is something less articulable than a moral, but more durable than an explanation. It is a sense of impermanence that does not feel like a warning, so much as a truth quietly offered, a truth that the modern world spends enormous energy trying not to acknowledge. The cities that exist now, the ones whose lights pulse across continents, and whose skylines define the horizons of contemporary life, will not always exist. They will not last forever. The materials of which they are built, however durable they seem, are subject to the same slow processes that turned the timbers of Monks Mound summit buildings into shadows in the soil. The institutions that organize them, however permanent they appear, are subject to the same erosions of confidence and belief that hollowed out the authority of the Cahokian elite. The populations that fill them, however numerous and adaptable, are subject to the same pressures of climate and disease and ecological depletion that thinned the population of the great floodplain city 7 centuries before the first skyscraper was conceived. None of this is meant as prophecy. It is meant only as observation. The pattern is older than any particular civilization, and it does not exempt any of them. For those who lie in the dark and listen to such stories, the recognition can be strangely settling rather than alarming. There is something almost gentle in the realization that the impermanence one feels in one's own life, the awareness that everything familiar will eventually pass, is not a personal anomaly but a feature of the broader fabric of which all human existence is woven. The people of Cahokia felt it too. They watched their own great projects begin to weather. They saw their own children grow up in a city that was no longer quite the city their grandparents had known. They made their own peace, however incompletely, with the slow turning of the wheel that carries every gathering, every flourishing, every brief and luminous concentration of human life back into the wider quiet from which it briefly emerged. Their peace, whatever form it took, is not directly available to those who come after them. But the fact that they made it, that they continued to live and love and bury their dead, even as the city around them slowly emptied, offers a kind of companionship across the centuries that no monument or museum can fully capture. The mounds, in the end, are not really memorials. They are not built to commemorate something that has already passed. They are gestures of continuity, made by people who believed that the labour of shaping Earth into meaning was worth doing, whether or not anyone in some distant future would understand what they had done. The fact that their meanings have been partially lost, that the specific stories and ceremonies and beliefs that animated the mounds have not survived in any complete form, does not erase the gesture itself. The gesture remains, in the soil, in the patient bulk of the Great Pyramid, in the ghostly outlines of plazas and circles and palisades, whose timbers have long since dissolved. The gesture says simply that people were here, that they built, that they watched the sky and tracked the seasons and gathered into something larger than themselves for as long as that gathering could be sustained. And then they let it go, and they carried what could be carried, and they walked outward into landscapes that would receive them and transform them, and the world continued, as the world always continues, beneath the slow, indifferent turning of the same stars they had once known by other names. The grass moves, the mounds rest beneath it. The night is very long, and somewhere far above the floodplain, the constellations that the Cahokian sky watchers once aligned their wooden circles to are still climbing, still sinking, still carrying their old patterns across the dark.